The Napa Valley sun filtered through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow fragments across her white dress, as if the heavens themselves were trying to color a canvas already written in advance. Sometimes it's the paths we don't choose that lead us exactly where our souls were meant to go, her grandmother had whispered the night before, adjusting the crown of wildflowers in her auburn hair one final time. These words now echoed in her head like a prayer, or perhaps a prophecy. 22 years of sheltered life, raised among the golden vineyards of her family's property in Sonoma Valley, and now her bare feet on the cold terracotta tiles led her toward a destiny she hadn't chosen, toward a man she had never known. She paused briefly before the antique mirror hanging in the entrance hall. The reflection that met her gaze wasn't that of a frightened girl, but of a woman whose green eyes betrayed a troubling mixture of resignation and determination. She was known throughout the region for three qualities that made her unique: her unwavering generosity toward the less fortunate, always bringing baskets of fresh bread and bottles of wine to families in need; her deep faith that caused her to rise before dawn to pray before the image of St. Mary that her grandfather had brought from New England, and that crystalline laugh that resonated through the whitewashed courtyards, capable of illuminating even the darkest days. But behind these distinctive traits lived a devastating internal conflict, the paralyzing fear of disappointing her family, who had raised her with such sacrifices after the financial collapse that had nearly destroyed them when a devastating drought had burned their vineyards. "Miss, they're waiting," said the voice of Meredith, the housekeeper, with hands knotted by arthritis, bringing her back to the present. Adelaide nodded, took a deep breath of the wildflower scent from her bouquet, and crossed the hall toward the estate's chapel where her destiny awaited, along with the 44-year-old man whose name she would now bear. Garrick Harrington stood straight as a cypress, his impeccable black suit accentuating his imposing figure. His chiseled face remained impassive, but something in his amber eyes betrayed a crack that no one seemed to notice. A wine and artisanal oil magnate whose fortune stretched across endless properties in Napa Valley, Sonoma, and the Oregon wine country, with century-old cellars and export contracts that made him one of the richest men in America. The lines beginning to form on his still vigorous face told stories of losses that had transformed him into a man of stone, enclosed in his shell of numbers and business. His motivation for accepting this arranged marriage was simple and cold. He needed an heir for his fortune, someone pure enough not to tarnish the name he had built, young enough to give him descendants. At his side, Emmett, Adelaide's father, a 65-year-old man whose calloused hands trembled as he signed the agreement, had a motivation that broke his heart with each beat. Saving the century-old estate that had belonged to the family for 4 generations, now threatened by unpayable debts that grew like weeds, after the disease that had ravaged their vineyards. He wept silently when she embraced him and whispered that everything would be fine, smelling the earthy scent that had always characterized her father. The ceremony took place on an October morning, under the unrelenting blue sky of California that seemed to ignore the tumult in her heart. Over the next 18 months, Adelaide's life would transform in ways she never could have imagined. During the first weeks, she discovered that Thornfield Estate, where she now lived, was a mausoleum of silence. Each immense room with its vaulted ceilings echoed with her solitary footsteps on the terracotta tiles. Garrick barely spoke to her during formal dinners served on fine china, where the tinkling of silver cutlery was the only sound beyond his polite requests to pass the salt. She slept alone in the master bedroom adorned with ceramic tiles, while he remained in his study until late at night, surrounded by papers and cigar smoke that seeped under the door. But then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, exploring the property's courtyards, she found an abandoned garden where jasmine and bougainvillea had grown wild, their branches intertwined in a chaos of neglected beauty. Without asking permission, she began to work there, her delicate hands bleeding as she cut and organized, planting new shoots of carnations and roses she had hidden in her bag during visits to the nearby town. The scent of flowers began to invade the house, mingling with the aroma of damp earth after watering. Garrick noticed. One morning she found him standing in the gallery, observing her work. "My ex-wife loved this garden," he said, and for the first time his voice carried something beyond coldness. It was pain. It was grief. It was a vulnerability he had hidden for nearly a decade, since the woman he had loved had abandoned him for another man, leaving for Seattle without looking back, and leaving him alone with wealth that couldn't fill the void. Adelaide began to leave small bouquets in his study. Garrick began to appear for breakfast. Conversations were brief, but something was changing like soil preparing for a new planting season. The first major obstacle came when Octavia, his sister, a 50-year-old woman always dressed in black in the traditional fashion and perfumed with violet water, arrived from Boston with a poisonous proposal. Annul the marriage, pay a generous sum to the young wife, and let her return to her family. "You're not suitable for him," she said, her eyes cold as a New England winter. "You're just a little country girl who doesn't understand our world." Octavia's motivation was clear, protecting the inheritance she hoped to receive, since she had no children and had always counted on her brother's fortune. But when Garrick discovered the proposal, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in years, he raised his voice. "She is my wife," he declared, and Adelaide felt her heart leap at the firmness in those words. "And it is not your place to decide who belongs in my life or not." Octavia left furiously, leaving behind only the scent of violets and the promise that this wasn't over. During the months that followed, Adelaide began to transform not only the gardens, but the entire estate. She opened the heavy shutters that kept the rooms in perpetual twilight, allowing the golden California sunlight to fill the spaces. She hired local musicians to play on weekends, filling the courtyards with melodies of guitars and passionate violins. She organized evenings for the vineyard workers and their families, personally serving homemade pies and clam chowder on long tables placed under the porticos, where the aroma of barbecue and country ham mingled with the scent of flowers. Garrick observed everything with an expression she couldn't completely decipher. Sometimes she caught him smiling as he watched her teach folk dances to the employees' children. Other times, she found him sitting alone in the library, looking at old photographs with tears in his eyes that he quickly wiped away. The second turning point came during a particularly violent spring storm. The wind howled like wild beasts, shaking the windows, while the rain drummed on the tiled roofs with a deafening force. The estate's electrical system failed, leaving them in darkness illuminated only by candles that cast dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls. She found him in his study, not working, but simply sitting in the dark. Without saying anything, she sat beside him. And there, in the darkness perfumed by melted wax and jasmine coming through the window, he began to speak. He told her about his first wife, how they had met when he was just a young administrator in his 20s, struggling to develop the family business. The 15 years they had spent together, building an empire of vineyards while desperately trying to start a family. The difficulties they had faced, the frustrations that accumulated, each failed attempt, leaving a deeper scar on their hearts. The day he discovered the love letters she exchanged with a Seattle businessman during a trade fair, and how within 3 weeks she packed her bags and left for Seattle, choosing a different life, and leaving him in a void so deep he thought he would never feel anything again. "I closed myself off," he confessed, his voice breaking in a way she would never have thought possible. "I promised myself never to allow that pain again. To turn my heart to stone, just as I transformed grapes into liquid gold." He paused, and in the flickering candlelight, she saw tears running down his still imposing face despite his suffering. "But you've brought life back into this house, and I don't know if I'm ready for that." Adelaide took his hand, feeling the rough skin of one who had worked all his life, and said simply, "You don't need to be ready. You just need to allow it." The transformation wasn't instantaneous. It was like watching a vine blossom, slow, gradual, but undeniably beautiful. Garrick began to accompany her on visits to needy families in the valley, carrying the heaviest baskets and conversing with the residents in a way she had never seen him do. He began to rise early to pray with her before the image of St. Mary, though he admitted he didn't really know if he believed, but he loved the peace he found there, with birdsong coming through the open windows. The greatest obstacle, however, was yet to come. A lawyer from Boston arrived with documents proving that Octavia was conspiring with dishonest associates to declare her brother mentally incompetent, arguing that the sudden marriage to an inexperienced young woman was evidence of premature mental deterioration. Adelaide saw the terror in his eyes, not of losing his fortune, but of losing control over his own life, of being locked away in some institution like a discarded object. But she was no longer the frightened girl who had descended those stairs months earlier. She sought the best lawyers in San Francisco, organized testimonies from field workers about the improvements he had implemented under her influence, presented financial documents proving his full mental capacity, and when she was called to testify, she spoke with a passion that surprised everyone present in the courtroom. This man gave me a home when my family needed one. I gave him a reason to start living again. This isn't madness, this is love. The case was dismissed, Octavia was exposed and ostracized, but the cost was high. Garrick had to cut ties with the only blood family he had left, a decision that haunted him on nights when she found him looking at old photographs of them as children, playing in the wheat fields of his childhood home. The following spring, when the vineyards were in bloom, filling the air with their delicate fragrance, something miraculous happened. Adelaide discovered she was pregnant. The news left them paralyzed, him fearing a repeat of past frustrations, her fearing she wouldn't live up to expectations. But together, hand in hand, they faced every medical consultation, every moment of anxiety. When she finally gave birth to a healthy baby girl whose cries resonated through the estate like celestial music, Garrick openly wept for the first time since she had known him. They named her Faye, because that's exactly what she represented. "You've taught me something I thought I had lost forever," he said, holding his daughter in his arms with a tenderness that contrasted with his large, calloused hands. "You've taught me that the heart can heal. That love isn't something we lose when someone abandons us, but something that multiplies when we allow others in." The estate, once a mausoleum of silence, transformed into a vibrant home. The child's laughter mingled with the scent of jasmine, the sound of music and the murmur of evenings, where workers and owners sat side by side sharing California wine and local cheeses. Adelaide hadn't just saved her family's estate in Sonoma, she had saved the soul of a man who thought he was beyond redemption. And when she saw him playing with Faye in the garden they had planted together, while the setting sun painted the white walls of the California estate gold, she understood that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not facing the unknown, but allowing the unknown to transform you. True love, she discovered, is not only given or received, it is cultivated like the century-old vineyards that now flourished in every corner of this land that had become her home. The first light of dawn filtered through the shutters of the master bedroom, casting golden rays on Adelaide's face as she lay awake, having not slept all night. A week had passed since the ceremony, and Thornfield Estate, where she now lived, seemed colder than a January morning in New England. Every immense room with its vaulted ceilings echoed with her solitary footsteps on the terracotta tiles. The antique furniture with precious wood finishes told the story of a powerful family, but remained desperately mute about the man who had become its master. Adelaide rose, slipped on a simple linen dress the color of lavender, and approached the window. The sun's rays caressed the vineyards that stretched as far as the eye could see, undulating like a green sea in the morning breeze. Everything she saw now belonged to her husband, or rather, she belonged to all of this, like another piece of furniture in this ancestral home. "Would Madam like her breakfast in the dining room or on the terrace?" asked Eleanor, the maid with perpetually downcast eyes. "On the terrace, please." Garrick barely spoke to her during formal dinners served on fine china, where the tinkling of silver cutlery was the only sound beyond his polite requests to pass the salt. She slept alone in the master bedroom, adorned with ceramic tiles, while he remained in his study until late at night, surrounded by papers and cigar smoke that seeped under the door. That morning, however, she was surprised to find him already seated on the terrace reading the Wall Street Journal with a cup of black coffee before him. He briefly looked up when she arrived, nodded slightly in greeting, then returned to his reading. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington," she said softly, taking a seat across from him. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrington," he replied in that deep voice that always seemed to measure each syllable. "I hope your room is to your liking. It's very beautiful." "Good." He folded his newspaper. "I'll be away for the day. Business in San Francisco. Don't wait up for dinner." Without another word he stood, adjusted his jacket and disappeared into the house, leaving behind a subtle scent of bergamot and leather. Adelaide contemplated her teacup, observing the leaves swirling at the bottom. Her grandmother had taught her to read the future in them, but today she saw only confused spirals. "You'll get used to it, madam," said Eleanor, placing a basket of fresh pastries on the table. "The master has always been this way. Since Madame Caroline left, she abruptly stopped as if she had just committed an unforgivable crime. Adelaide raised her head, suddenly more attentive. Madame Caroline, forgive me, it's not my place to... Please excuse me. Eleanor slipped away, leaving Adelaide with a new piece of the puzzle that was her husband. A name, Caroline, and the shadow of a story that seemed to haunt the corridors of this dwelling. The following days, she spent exploring the estate, seeking her place in this world that had not waited for her to exist. The cellars delved under the hill like underground cathedrals, where thousands of bottles rested, labelled by years and grape varieties. The stables housed 6 thoroughbred horses with gleaming coats. The vineyards were just beginning to bud, preparing their green spectacle that would soon attract tourists. But it was in the library that Adelaide spent most of her time, browsing the shelves laden with rare works, seeking to understand this man she had married through the books he read. From treatises on viticulture to novels by Hemingway, from accounting ledgers to poems by Whitman, Garrick's spirit seemed as vast as it was contradictory. One evening, while exploring the rarely used West Wing, she found a corridor leading to a small inner courtyard. Pushing open the rusty door, she discovered an abandoned garden where jasmine and bougainvillea had grown wild, their branches intertwined in a chaos of neglected beauty. A stone fountain at the center was dry, its spout silent for years. Something in this forgotten place resonated within her like a call. Without thinking, she knelt and began to pull the weeds that were choking a rosebush with once white flowers, now grey with dust. "It was her garden," said a voice behind her. Adelaide started. Meredith, the old housekeeper, stood in the doorway, carrying a tray with a pitcher of water and a glass. "Madame Caroline's." Meredith nodded slowly. "She created it when they married. She said an estate without a secret garden was like a heart without love. Magnificent, perhaps, but incomplete." She approached and set the tray on a moss-covered stone bench. When she left, the master gave orders to close this part of the estate. No one has entered it for 8 years. Why did she leave? Meredith's eyes clouded with sadness. "Love is like these roses, madam. Without constant care, it withers. The master worked a lot, building his empire. Madame Caroline felt lonely. One day she met someone who promised her a different life in Seattle. She packed her bags and never returned." Adelaide looked around, suddenly seeing this abandoned garden as a reflection of Garrick's soul, once alive, now closed off to the world. "I shouldn't be here then," she said, rising. "On the contrary, madam." Meredith handed her the glass of water. "Perhaps this garden has been waiting for someone like you." Without asking permission, Adelaide began to work in the secret garden, her delicate hands bleeding as she cut and organized, planting new shoots of carnations and roses she had hidden in her bag during visits to town. The scent of flowers began to invade this part of the estate, mingling with the aroma of damp earth after watering. Each morning, she rose at dawn, prayed before her image of Saint Mary, then headed to the garden where she worked until noon, when the California heat became too intense. Her hands, once soft and well-tended, now bore the marks of her labor. Calluses, scratches, dirt encrusted under her nails. Yet, for the first time since her arrival, she felt alive. Garrick remained distant, rarely sharing more than a few sentences with her during meals. But one day as she returned from the garden, her hair disheveled and her dress stained with earth, she caught him observing a bouquet of white roses she had placed in a crystal vase on the grand salon console. "Do you like flowers, madam?" he asked, delicately touching a petal with his fingertips. "I like what they represent, sir. Perseverance. Beauty that survives despite everything." He looked at her, really looked perhaps for the first time, noting the scratches on her arms, the dirt under her nails, and that light in her eyes that wasn't there when she arrived. "Where do they come from?" Adelaide hesitated for a moment. "From the garden in the west courtyard." A flash crossed his eyes. Surprise, anger, pain? She couldn't tell. But his voice remained calm when he responded, "I see." The next morning, Adelaide found a basket of new gardening tools outside her door, pruners, gloves, trowels, and a pair of silver scissors, engraved with the initials A.H. Adelaide Harrington. No note, no explanation. But the message was clear. That same day, as she worked to restore the fountain, Garrick appeared at the garden entrance. He stood there, motionless, observing her work. "My ex-wife loved this garden," he said, And for the first time his voice carried something beyond coldness. It was pain. It was grief. It was a vulnerability he had hidden for nearly a decade, since the woman he had loved had abandoned him for another man, leaving for Seattle without looking back, and leaving him alone with wealth that couldn't fill the void. Adelaide wiped her hands on her apron and straightened, not knowing what to say. She used to say that flowers never lie, he continued, his gaze lost in the past. They promise to bloom if you care for them, and they keep that promise. People aren't so reliable. Some promises are harder to keep than others, Adelaide responded gently. He looked at her then, really looked, his amber eyes searching hers as if seeking something. Why are you doing this? Restoring this garden? Because beauty should never be abandoned, she replied without hesitation. Even when it hurts. He didn't answer, but something changed in his gaze. He nodded slightly and left, leaving Adelaide wondering if she had imagined this brief moment of connection. That same evening, for the first time, Garrick asked her to accompany him to his study after dinner. The room was exactly as she had imagined it, walls panelled in dark wood, shelves groaning under the weight of books, a massive desk covered with papers, and a lingering scent of cigar and leather. "I need to go to Napa tomorrow on business," he announced, serving her a glass of cognac which she accepted out of politeness. "I'll be gone for 3 days. I was wondering if you'd like to accompany me." The surprise must have shown on her face, for he quickly added, "Of course, you're not obligated. I understand you have your garden and your occupations here." Adelaide took a small sip of cognac, appreciating the warmth that spread through her chest. "I would very much like to accompany you, Mr. Harrington." "Garrick," he said softly. "You can call me Garrick when we're alone." A slight smile formed on Adelaide's lips. It was a small step, but a step nonetheless. The trip to Napa was revealing for Adelaide. In the private car, then in the limousine that drove them to the vineyard where Garrick owned shares, she discovered a facet of her husband she hadn't suspected, the brilliant, respected, sometimes feared businessman whose decisions made and broke fortunes. At the table with associates, she observed him negotiate with surgical precision, his face remaining impassive even when concluding deals worth millions. He seemed to be two distinct people, the taciturn man of the estate and this charismatic negotiator who held his world in balance on the tip of a pen. In the evening, in their suite at the Auberge du Soleil, Adelaide stood before the mirror, adjusting the emerald silk evening gown he had delivered to their room. She felt foreign to herself in this luxury, far from the vineyards of her childhood. "You look magnificent," said Garrick, appearing behind her in the reflection. He wore a black tuxedo that accentuated his imposing figure, his salt-and-pepper hair combed back, revealing an aristocratic face that time had only refined. "Thank you," she murmured, troubled by the sincerity she perceived in his voice. He approached and placed a black velvet box in her hand. "I thought this would complete your outfit." Inside was a necklace of emeralds and diamonds, whose brilliance seemed to capture all the light in the room. Adelaide was speechless. It's too much." "No," he said simply, taking the necklace to place it around her neck. His fingers brushed her nape in a touch that sent a shiver down her spine. "It's exactly what you need." At the gala that followed, Adelaide felt gazes fall upon her, some admiring, others curious, a few clearly disapproving. She understood then that her marriage had been the subject of speculation in this closed world where everyone knew each other. "Garrick Harrington and his young bride," murmured a silver-haired woman passing near them. "How refreshing." The condescending tone didn't escape Adelaide, but Garrick royally ignored it, his hand lightly resting on the small of her back to guide her to their table. "Don't mind Mrs. Caldwell," he said in a low voice. "She never forgave my father for refusing her business alliance proposal 30 years ago." The evening was proceeding without major incident when an elegant woman in her 40s approached their table. She wore a black dress that highlighted her graceful silhouette and a pearl necklace that seemed almost modest compared to the jewels that glittered around them. "Garrick," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What a surprise to see you here." Adelaide felt her husband instantly stiffen, as if an electric current had passed through him. "Carolyn," he responded in a voice so neutral it became glacial. "I didn't know you still frequented these events." Carolyn. The name resonated in Adelaide's mind like thunder. The ex-wife, the one who had planted the garden then abandoned it, the one who had broken this man to the point where he had transformed into a pillar of salt. Daniel is now on the board of directors, she responded, indicating a man at a table some distance away. We couldn't miss this. Her gaze then fell on Adelaide, assessing her with undisguised curiosity. And you must be the new Mrs. Harrington. Enchanted. Adelaide felt the weight of that gaze that compared her, judged her, perhaps seeking flaws. She straightened slightly. The pleasure is all mine, madam. An enigmatic smile passed over Caroline's lips. Garrick has always had exquisite taste. She touched the emerald necklace that adorned Adelaide's neck. I see he still loves green so much. It was also my favorite color. The air suddenly seemed to thin around them. Adelaide realized with a shock that the necklace she wore had probably belonged to this woman. Is your garden still blooming so magnificently? Caroline asked Garrick, as if Adelaide had ceased to exist. My wife has restored it, he replied, his hand seeking Adelaide's under the table. It has never been more beautiful. Something passed through Caroline's eyes. Surprise, annoyance, perhaps even a touch of regret. Really? How touching. She straightened, adjusting her silk stole on her shoulders. Well, I wouldn't want to disturb you further. Enjoy your evening. She walked away with that feline grace that seemed to be her trademark, leaving behind a scent of jasmine and a heavy silence. I'm sorry, Garrick finally said, his voice barely audible. I didn't know she would be here. Adelaide gently squeezed his hand, noting with surprise that he hadn't withdrawn it. It's not your fault. The necklace, he began, is beautiful, Adelaide interrupted with a gentle smile. But if you don't mind, I would prefer to wear it for a special occasion rather than tonight. Something in his gaze softened like ice slowly beginning to melt. Of course. That night, in their suite, they slept in separate rooms, as at the estate. But the next morning, when Adelaide found a white rose placed on her pillow with a note simply saying, "Thank you," she knew that something had changed between them. The return to the estate coincided with the arrival of a letter sealed with red wax bearing the emblem of a panther, the seal of Octavia Harrington, Garrick's sister. Adelaide observed her husband read the missive, his face closing as his eyes scanned the lines of fine, slanted handwriting. A problem? She asked softly, as he set the letter on the rosewood secretary in the grand salon. My sister announces her visit. His voice had returned to that of the distant Garrick she had known upon her arrival. She'll be here tomorrow for a few days. The tone of this simple announcement contained a warning that Adelaide immediately perceived. Octavia wasn't a simple family visit. She represented a threat, or at least a challenge. Should I prepare anything special for her stay? Garrick looked at her with an indecipherable expression. Be yourself, Adelaide. That's all I ask of you. It was the first time he had used her name outside of their nascent intimacy, and something in the way he pronounced it, like a prayer or a promise, deeply troubled her. Octavia arrived the next day in a black Bentley, driven by a chauffeur with a military bearing. At 50, she was an imposing woman, tall and thin, with a haughty bearing, always dressed in black in the traditional fashion and perfumed with violet water. Her steel-grey hair was coiffed in a chignon so tight it seemed to pull her facial features upward, giving her a perpetually haughty expression. My dear brother, she said, offering her cheek to Garrick for a kiss that resembled a formality more than a sign of affection. Her gaze then fell upon Adelaide, evaluating her as one would examine a horse at auction. And here, then, is the new Mrs. Harrington. Pleased to make your acquaintance, madam, Adelaide responded politely. Miss, Octavia corrected sharply. I've never needed a man to define my identity. Dinner that evening was an exercise in patience for Adelaide. Octavia monopolized the conversation, speaking of Boston, her literary circles, her charitable works, always with a subtle condescension, suggesting that none of these topics could be truly understood by a little country girl from Sonoma, as she had defined Adelaide when addressing her brother. And how do you find estate life, my dear? Octavia finally asked, barely wetting her lips in her glass of dessert wine. It must be quite different from— Where did you come from, again? Vineyard View Estate, near Sonoma, Adelaide responded without losing her composure. And I find life here enriching, though different, yes. Enriching, Octavia repeated with a small laugh that sounded like broken glass. What an interesting choice of words. Garrick, who had remained silent during the exchange, then intervened. Adelaide has restored Caroline's garden. She has a gift with plants. The mention of the garden and Carolyn seemed to strike Octavia like a slap. "Really? I thought you had ordered it permanently closed." "Things change, Octavia," Garrick responded simply. That night, as Adelaide prepared for bed, a light knock came at her door. Octavia stood in the hallway, dressed in a black silk robe that made her resemble a raven. "May I come in?" she asked without waiting for a response, advancing into the room with that assurance of those who have never known refusal. Adelaide, surprised, tightened her robe around herself. "Of course." Octavia examined the room, noting the small changes Adelaide had made to it. The lighter curtains, the fresh flower bouquets, the image of St. Mary placed on the nightstand. "Do you know why I've come, Adelaide?" she finally asked, turning toward her. "To see your brother, I imagine." "To protect him," Octavia corrected. "From himself, and from you." Adelaide felt a chill run down her spine, but maintained a neutral expression. "I don't understand. My brother is a brilliant man, but vulnerable. Carolyn nearly destroyed him." She took a few steps in the room, touching objects with her fingertips as if assessing their value. "And now, barely 8 years later, he marries an unknown woman half his age. Don't you find that concerning?" "What concerns me is my husband's happiness," Adelaide responded, surprised by her own assurance. Octavia emitted a dry little laugh. "Happiness? Really? Not the vineyards, the properties, the bank accounts?" She approached then, so close that Adelaide could smell the violet scent emanating from her, mixed with something more acrid, like crystallized bitterness. "I have a proposal for you, my dear. A poisonous proposal. Annul the marriage, pay a generous sum to the young bride, and let her return to her family. You're not suitable for him," she said, her eyes cold as a New England winter. "You're just a little country girl who doesn't understand our world." Octavia's motivation was clear, protecting the inheritance she hoped to receive, since she had no children and had always counted on her brother's fortune. Adelaide felt anger rising within her, but also a strange pity for this woman who seemed to live only by proxy, through her brother's name and fortune. "I'm sorry, Miss Harrington, but I must decline your offer. I am Garrick's wife, not a purchase that can be returned when it doesn't please." Octavia's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Don't mistake your position. You are nothing without the Harrington name." "And you, miss?" Adelaide responded softly. "What would you be without that same name?" Octavia stepped back as if she had been slapped, then straightened to her full height. "You'll regret this," she murmured before leaving the room, leaving behind a threat that floated in the air like a toxic perfume. Adelaide sat on her bed, trembling. For the first time since her arrival at the estate, she felt truly in danger. Not physically, but as if everything she had begun to build here, including this fragile connection with Garrick, was threatened by this woman whose resentment seemed limitless. The next morning, the atmosphere at breakfast was so tense that Adelaide had the impression the air itself crackled with static electricity. Octavia, impeccable in her black suit, sipped her tea with a malevolent satisfaction, while Garrick remained absorbed in reading his correspondence, apparently unaware of the tension that reigned. Adelaide wondered if she should tell him about his sister's nocturnal visit and her proposal, but something held her back, the fear perhaps that he might consider the offer reasonable. After all, what had she really brought to this marriage, if not the financial rescue of her father's property? "I've been thinking, my dear brother," Octavia suddenly announced, setting down her cup with a delicate clink. "About your investment in the Oregon vineyards. I think you should reconsider." Garrick finally raised his eyes from his papers. "And why is that?" "The tests show the terroir is excellent. It's not the terroir that concerns me, but your recent distractions." Her gaze briefly fell on Adelaide. "Some of your associates are questioning your judgment. This hasty marriage, for example." Adelaide felt her cheeks flame, but maintained her composure, methodically buttering a piece of bread, as if the conversation didn't concern her. "My associates would do better to mind their own business," Garrick responded in a neutral tone. "And so should you, Octavia. I'm simply concerned for you, for our name. The Harringtons have always been synonymous with excellence and sound judgment." She smiled at Adelaide, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "My dear, you cannot understand the weight of a name like ours. It's a legacy, a responsibility." "I understand perfectly the weight of names, Miss Harrington," Adelaide responded gently. "My grandfather planted the first vineyard of our estate with his own hands. 4 generations have worked that land, loved it, drawn their livelihood from it. The value of a name is not measured by its antiquity, but by the love and respect it inspires. A silence followed her declaration. Garrick was looking at her with an expression she had never seen before, a sort of admiration mixed with surprise, as if he were discovering a new facet of her. Such eloquence, Octavia sneered, but fine words do not replace birth and education. Enough. Garrick's voice cracked like a whip. You've gone too far, Octavia. On the contrary, brother. I've barely begun. She pulled from her bag a document that she delicately placed on the table. Do you know what this is? Garrick glanced at the paper and his face stiffened. Where did you get this? I have my sources. It's a psychiatric evaluation written by Dr. Lawrence, a very accommodating friend. She turned toward Adelaide, whose heart was now racing. It suggests that my brother is suffering from early cognitive deterioration, which explains his recent irrational decisions. Like this marriage, for example. The room suddenly seemed to spin around Adelaide. She understood in an instant Octavia's plan. To have her brother declared mentally incompetent, arguing that the sudden marriage to an inexperienced young woman was evidence of premature mental deterioration. Adelaide saw the terror in Garrick's eyes, not of losing his fortune, but of losing control over his own life, of being locked away in some institution like a discarded object. It's ridiculous, he said, but his voice lacked assurance. Is it? Octavia arched a perfectly drawn eyebrow. The board of directors might not agree. Neither would the family court, for that matter. You can't do this, he murmured, and for the first time, Adelaide saw fear in his eyes, a deep, visceral fear. I can, and I will. Unless... She left her sentence hanging, looking at Adelaide with an obvious meaning. Adelaide felt her blood freeze. It was either her or him. If she stayed, Octavia would use this terrible weapon against Garrick. If she left, accepting the money offered the night before, everything would stop. She rose slowly, her legs trembling. I'll pack my things, she said in a barely audible voice. No. Garrick's voice was firm now, almost angry. He rose as well, and something extraordinary happened. For the first time in years, he raised his voice. She is my wife, he declared, and Adelaide felt her heart leap at the firmness in those words. And it is not your place to decide who belongs in my life or not. He turned to Adelaide, his eyes burning with an emotion she had never seen in them before. Don't leave, please. These last 3 words, spoken with a vulnerability that contrasted with his rigid posture, touched Adelaide more deeply than any grand declaration could have. I won't leave, she responded simply, taking his hand in hers. Octavia observed them, her face passing from surprise to fury. You'll regret this, Garrick, I promise you. Perhaps, he responded, gently squeezing Adelaide's hand. But it will be my choice. Now I ask you to leave my house. Octavia rose with an icy dignity. You haven't heard the last of this matter. She headed toward the door, then turned one last time. She'll destroy you just as Carolyn did. That's what they all do. When she was gone, silence fell over the room again. Adelaide looked at their joined hands, not daring to raise her eyes to Garrick, fearing what she might read there. I'm sorry, he finally said. My sister has always been... difficult, but I never imagined she would go this far. She loves you in her way? Adelaide responded gently. She's afraid of losing the only person who truly matters to her. Garrick looked at her in amazement. You're defending her after what she just did. Adelaide smiled sadly. Understanding is not excusing, but yes, I can comprehend her fear. He slowly shook his head. You're extraordinary, Adelaide Harrington, and I've been a fool not to see it sooner. It was the first time he pronounced her full name, his name become hers, with a tenderness that melted something within her. It wasn't love yet, perhaps, but it was the beginning of something that might one day resemble it. The weeks following Octavia's tumultuous departure marked a turning point in life at Thornfield Estate. As if an invisible dam had broken, Garrick began to open up to Adelaide, slowly at first, then with a growing trust that transformed their relationship day by day. In the months that followed, she began to transform not only the gardens, but the entire estate. She opened the heavy shutters that kept the rooms in perpetual twilight, allowing the golden California sunlight to fill the spaces. She hired local musicians to play on weekends, filling the courtyards with melodies of guitars and passionate violins. She organized evenings for the vineyard workers and their families, personally serving homemade pies and stews on long tables placed under the porticos, where the aroma of barbecue and country ham mingled with the scent of flowers. Garrick observed everything with an expression she couldn't completely decipher. Sometimes she caught him smiling as he watched her teach folk dances to the employees' children. Other times she found him sitting alone in the library, looking at old photographs with tears in his eyes that he quickly wiped away. One April morning, as she worked in the garden that had now become an explosion of colors and fragrances, Garrick appeared at the entrance, carrying a carefully wrapped package. "I have something for you," he said, sitting on the stone bench beside her. Adelaide wiped her earthy hands on her apron and took the package with curiosity. Inside was a leather-bound book, visibly ancient and precious. "Treatise on Secret Gardens," she read on the cover adorned with gold leaf. "Published in 1878. "It belonged to my grandmother," explained Garrick. "She was passionate about botany, like you. I found it in the East Wing Library. I thought you might like it." Adelaide delicately leafed through the time-yellowed pages, admiring the detailed illustrations of plants and flowers, garden diagrams, and handwritten notes in the margins. It was more than just a book. It was a legacy, a link between generations of women who had inhabited this estate. "It's wonderful," she murmured, deeply touched by the gesture. "I thought you might use some of these ideas for our garden." Our garden. Not Carolyn's garden, but theirs. It was an acknowledgement worth all the jewels in the world. "I'd like to show you something," she said impulsively. "If you have a moment." He nodded, intrigued, and followed her to a secluded corner of the garden that she had deliberately left hidden behind a hedge of pruned cypress. There, in an intimate space protected from the wind and prying eyes, bloomed a square of wild grapevines, not the commercial variety from the surrounding fields, but a rare species with white fruit that she had specially brought from her father's property. "White grapes," murmured Garrick, visibly moved. "I've never seen them." "They're very rare," explained Adelaide. "In the language of flowers, they symbolize purity and rebirth. My father says they only grow in places where love has been lost and then found again." She stopped, suddenly aware of the intimacy of her words. But Garrick didn't seem uncomfortable. He knelt, gently touching the small white fruits that perfumed the air with a more subtle, more delicate aroma than their purple cousins. "It's magnificent," he said simply, then, raising his eyes to her, "Like you." The compliment, so direct and sincere, caught her by surprise. She felt her cheeks flush and looked away, troubled by the intensity now shining in Garrick's eyes. "Thank you," she murmured, not knowing what else to say. They remained silent for a moment, surrounded by the buzzing of bees and the intoxicating scent of the white grapes. Then, in a gesture that seemed both natural and extraordinary, Garrick took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "Adelaide," he said, his voice taking on a tone she had never heard before, vulnerable, almost trembling. "I haven't been a good husband to you. You haven't—" He gently raised his free hand to interrupt her. "Let me finish, please. I've spent years hiding behind walls I built after Carolyn left. I thought it was safer that way, feeling nothing, depending on no one. When I accepted this marriage, it was for practical, cold reasons. You were a transaction." The word hurt, but Adelaide understood he needed this brutal honesty. "But you've changed all that," he continued, gently squeezing her hand. "Not by trying to change me, but simply by being yourself, by bringing life, light, and beauty where there was only silence and darkness." He took a deep breath as if gathering his courage. "I don't know if I'm capable of loving like before. I don't even know if I deserve someone like you, but I would like to try, if you're willing." Adelaide felt tears rise to her eyes, not tears of sadness, but of an emotion so pure, so intense that it had no name. "I am," she responded simply. That evening, for the first time since their marriage, Garrick didn't return to his study after dinner. He accompanied her to her room, stopping at the door like a young man on a first date. "Good night, Adelaide," he said softly. Then, leaning toward her, he kissed her, a tender, almost timid kiss that carried within it the promise of all those that might follow. "Good night, Garrick," she responded, her heart beating wildly as she closed the door behind her. That night, lying in her bed, Adelaide understood that their story was only truly beginning. The walls that separated them, physical and emotional, were beginning to crumble. The metamorphosis was underway, as slow and inevitable as the blossoming of the vines under the California sun. The June sun burned the California hills with an almost tangible heat when the mailman brought the letter that would change everything. Adelaide recognized it immediately. The thick paper, the official seal, the elegant handwriting of her father's notary. News from the family estate. She opened it in the garden, seated on her favorite bench, surrounded by white roses. As she read, her face paled beneath her light summer tan. The disease that had ravaged their vineyards had reappeared, more virulent than ever. The bank was threatening to foreclose on the property if the loan that Garrick had guaranteed wasn't fully repaid within 3 months. Her father, too proud to ask for more help, had simply wanted to inform her of the situation. Adelaide folded the letter with a trembling hand. Since her marriage, her family's financial situation had temporarily stabilized thanks to Garrick's intervention, who had negotiated extensions with creditors. But now, she hadn't heard her husband approach, absorbed as she was in her troubled thoughts. He stood before her, his face grave, holding a letter of his own. "Bad news?" he asked softly. She looked up, surprised by his perceptiveness. Their relationship had evolved over the past months toward an intimacy that surprised them both. They now shared the same bedroom, their nocturnal conversations often extending until dawn. He accompanied her on visits to needy families in the valley, carrying the heaviest baskets and conversing with the residents in a way she had never seen him do. He began to rise early to pray with her before the image of Saint Mary, though he admitted he didn't really know if he believed, but loved the peace he found there, with birdsong coming through the open windows. "My father, the disease has returned to the vineyards," she explained, handing him the letter. "And you?" He sat beside her, his shoulder touching hers in that contact that had become familiar and comforting. "Octavia has done what she promised." He handed her his own letter. It was an official summons from a family court, requesting Garrick to present himself for an evaluation of his mental capacities, following a request filed by his sister. "She'll never give up, will she?" murmured Adelaide, feeling a mixture of anger and fear rising within her. "No," he confirmed, his face more tense than she had seen it in a long time. "Octavia has always been determined. Since our childhood." He rose, taking a few steps along the path bordered with lavender, his hands clasped behind his back. "The problem is that this time she might succeed." "How? It's absurd. You're perfectly sane." "Am I?" He turned to her with a bitter smile. "A 44-year-old man who suddenly marries a 22-year-old woman after living like a hermit for 8 years, who transforms his austere estate into a place of feasts and music, who delegates a growing part of his business to spend more time in his garden." He paused, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "From Octavia's perspective, and perhaps many others, these are the signs of a man in the midst of a midlife crisis, if not worse." Adelaide rose as well and approached him, taking his face between her hands with a tenderness mixed with determination. "These are the signs of a man who is relearning to live, Garrick. Who is rediscovering what gives meaning beyond numbers and contracts." He covered her hands with his amber eyes seeking in hers a reassurance that she strove to project, despite her own worry. "If she wins," he said in a low, almost broken voice, "I'll lose everything. Control of my business, my freedom of decision, perhaps even this estate. And you—" He didn't finish his sentence, but Adelaide understood. If Garrick were declared incompetent, their marriage could be annulled, considered the fruit of manipulation or a troubled mind. She would be left with nothing, and her family would definitively lose their estate. "She won't win," Adelaide asserted with a conviction she drew from her nascent love for this complex and wounded man. "We won't let her win." That evening, a storm broke over California, one of those violent storms that seemed to want to tear the sky to shreds. The wind howled like wild beasts, shaking the windows, while the rain drummed on the tiled roofs with a deafening force. The estate's electrical system failed, leaving them in darkness illuminated only by candles that cast dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls. Adelaide found Garrick in his study, not working, but simply sitting in the dark. Without saying anything, she sat beside him. And there, in the darkness perfumed by melted wax and jasmine coming through the window, he began to speak. He told her about his childhood in the shadow of an authoritarian father who accepted only excellence, of a distant mother who sought in alcohol an escape from her unhappy marriage. How Octavia, 12 years his senior, had become both his protector and his jailer, loving him with a possessive love that tolerated no other loyalty. He told her about his first wife, how they had met when he was just a young administrator in his 20s, struggling to develop the family business. The 15 years they had spent together, building an empire of vineyards while desperately trying to start a family. The difficulties they had faced, the frustrations that accumulated, each failed attempt, leaving a deeper scar on their hearts. The day he discovered the love letters she exchanged with a Seattle businessman during a trade fair, and how within 3 weeks she packed her bags and left for Seattle, choosing a different life, and leaving him in a void so deep he thought he would never feel anything again. "I closed myself off," he confessed, his voice breaking in a way she would never have thought possible. "I promised myself never to allow that pain again, to turn my heart to stone just as I transformed grapes into liquid gold." He paused, and in the flickering candlelight, she saw tears running down his still imposing face despite his suffering. "But you've brought life back into this house, and I don't know if I'm ready for that." Adelaide took his hand, feeling the rough skin of one who had worked all his life, and said simply, "You don't need to be ready. You just need to allow it." He looked at her then, truly, as if she were an apparition, a miracle he dared not believe real. Then, in a gesture as natural as it was unexpected, he drew her to him and kissed her with a passion that contained all the emotions he had repressed for so long: fear, hope, desire, and perhaps love. The storm continued to rumble outside, but in this candle-lit room, two souls found shelter in each other, a refuge against the storms of the world. Summer settled over California like a veil of oppressive heat. The vineyards reached their peak, transforming the hills into purple waves that undulated under the occasional breeze. In this almost supernatural beauty, Adelaide and Garrick prepared their defense against Octavia's attack. But she was no longer the frightened girl who had descended those stairs months earlier. She sought the best lawyers in San Francisco, organized testimonies from field workers about the improvements he had implemented under her influence, presented financial documents proving his full mental capacity. While Adelaide handled the legal aspects, Garrick faced an even greater challenge: regaining the trust of his associates and business partners whom Octavia had systematically contacted to sow doubt about his mental health. One morning, as they breakfasted on the terrace, Eleanor brought an urgent telegram. Garrick read it quickly, his face darkening. "What is it?" asked Adelaide, recognizing the signs of tension in the line of his jaw. "The Napa Valley Wine Consortium is convening an extraordinary meeting. Octavia has convinced 3 of my largest investors to request my temporary removal from the presidency, pending the results of the medical evaluation." He crumpled the telegram, his fingers pressing the paper as if he wanted to annihilate it. "It's worse than I thought. She's not just seeking to control my personal assets, she wants to take everything, the businesses too." Adelaide felt a chill run through her, despite the morning heat. "When is this meeting scheduled?" "In 3 days. In Napa." She set down her teacup, her mind rapidly calculating the implications. "We must go. Together." Garrick looked at her in surprise. "It's a business meeting, Adelaide. Brutal, political, full of maneuvers and betrayals. It's not a place for—" "For a woman?" she interrupted with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Or specifically for your wife." He had the decency to appear embarrassed. "I meant it would be difficult. These men are traditional." "Perfect," she responded, rising with a new determination. "Then let's show them what tradition really means. A man and a woman, united in the face of adversity." 3 days later, they entered the conference room of the Auberge du Soleil in Napa, where 12 men in dark suits and 3 women in austere tailored outfits waited around a massive mahogany table. Adelaide had chosen for the occasion a midnight blue sheath dress, sober but elegant, her only jewelry being her wedding ring, and a simple silver brooch representing a grapevine that Garrick had given her the day before. The surprise was visible on faces when Garrick presented Adelaide not as a simple companion, but as his partner in this affair. "My wife knows all aspects of our operations in Sonoma," he declared in a firm voice. And since these operations represent 40% of our total turnover, her presence is not only appropriate, but necessary. The meeting began in an icy atmosphere. Benjamin Donovan, a Napa vintner with an imposing build and a face reddened by years of wine tasting, spoke first. "Garrick, no one here questions your past accomplishments," he began with a false sympathy that made Adelaide want to spill her water glass on his impeccable suit. "But in recent months, your decisions have been, let's say, unusual." "Unusual or innovative, Benjamin?" Garrick calmly responded. "Because if increasing our organic production by 30% while reducing costs by 15% is unusual, then I plead guilty." Murmurs traversed the assembly. Adelaide recognized the tactic, shifting the conversation toward concrete results rather than personal insinuations. "We're not talking about numbers," interjected Eleanor Mercer, a woman in her 60s whose steel-grey chignon unpleasantly reminded Adelaide of Octavia, "but about behavior. Your sister has informed us of your lifestyle changes." "My sister," Garrick responded with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "should perhaps focus on her own life rather than mine." "She's concerned about you," insisted Eleanor, "as are we all. This hasty marriage, these festivities at the estate, this new approach to management, this isn't the Garrick Harrington we know." It was then that Adelaide decided it was time to intervene. She rose slowly, attracting all gazes. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began in a clear and assured voice that surprised even Garrick, "allow me to speak to you not as a wife, but as a business partner." She pulled from her bag a dossier that she distributed to each board member. "Here is a detailed analysis of the consortium's performance under my husband's direction over the past 8 years, compared to the 8 months since our marriage." The numbers spoke for themselves: a significant increase in productivity, a diversification of markets, an improvement in quality recognized by 3 recent international awards. "If this is what you call mental instability," she concluded with a slight smile, "then perhaps we should all aspire to such a state." A silence followed her presentation. Garrick was looking at her with a mixture of pride and wonder, as if discovering yet another new facet of this woman he had married almost by accident. "These numbers are impressive," Benjamin Donovan finally admitted, "but they don't address our main concern." "Which is?" asked Garrick. "Your personal judgment, Garrick." It was the voice of James Lefroy, the oldest member of the board, a man Garrick had always considered a mentor. "Octavia has presented troubling evidence, testimonies from people close to you who are concerned about changes in your behavior." "What people?" asked Adelaide, feeling anger rising within her despite her efforts to remain calm. "Who exactly claims to know my husband better than I do?" James cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "Well, there's Carolyn, for example." The name fell into the room like a stone in a pond, creating ripples of almost palpable tension. Garrick stiffened beside Adelaide. "Carolyn," he repeated slowly, "my ex-wife, who left me 8 years ago for another man, now claims to be concerned about my mental health. She says you weren't emotionally stable after your separation, that this new marriage might be an impulsive reaction to loneliness rather than a considered decision." Adelaide felt Garrick's hand tighten on hers under the table. She returned this pressure, silently transmitting her strength to him. "James," said Garrick in a surprisingly gentle voice, "you've known me for over 20 years. You saw what Carolyn's departure did to me. Yes, I suffered. Yes, I withdrew into myself. For 8 years I lived like an automaton, growing businesses whose success no longer brought me any joy." He rose, inviting Adelaide to do the same. "And then I met this extraordinary woman who reminded me that life is not reduced to balance sheets and export contracts. Is it madness to rediscover happiness? Is it instability to reopen one's heart?" A murmur traversed the assembly, no longer hostile, but thoughtful. "If you want to remove me from the consortium's presidency because you think I've lost my reason by finding love, then vote," he concluded. "But know that you'll lose not only the best president this organization has ever had, but also access to our Sonoma vineyards, which, as these reports show, have become the most profitable in our portfolio." The silence that followed was charged with tension. Then, against all expectations, James Lefroy slowly rose and applauded. One by one, the other board members joined him, until the room resonated with applause. "It seems we've been misinformed," said James with a warm smile. "The board unanimously rejects the motion to suspend Garrick Harrington from his functions." Leaving the hotel hand in hand, Adelaide and Garrick knew they had won an important battle. But the war with Octavia was far from over. The respite was short-lived. A week after their return from Napa, as summer reached its burning peak, a lawyer from Boston arrived with documents proving that Octavia was conspiring with dishonest associates to declare her brother mentally incompetent, arguing that the sudden marriage to an inexperienced young woman was evidence of premature mental deterioration. Martin Blake, a thin man with gold-rimmed glasses and an impeccable suit despite the heat, presented the papers with a grave expression that presaged nothing good. "These documents were filed yesterday with the Boston Superior Court," he explained, seated in Garrick's study where the open windows let in air barely freshened by the garden fountains. "Miss Harrington is requesting not only a complete psychiatric evaluation, but also the appointment of a judicial administrator to manage your affairs during the procedure." Adelaide saw the terror in Garrick's eyes, not of losing his fortune, but of losing control over his own life, of being locked away in some institution like a discarded object. "On what grounds?" she asked, instinctively squeezing her husband's hand. Martin Blake adjusted his glasses, visibly uncomfortable. "The allegations are substantial. Testimonies from several people, including Mr. Harrington's ex-wife, concerning erratic behavior, personality changes, reckless spending, and—" He paused, searching for words. "And?" Garrick pressed, his voice tense as a violin string. "And suggestions of possible manipulation on your part, Mrs. Harrington," the lawyer concluded, avoiding her gaze. "Miss Harrington alleges that you deliberately seduced her brother to access his fortune, taking advantage of his emotional vulnerability." Adelaide felt like a physical blow, the air leaving her lungs. "That's absurd." "Of course," Martin quickly agreed. "I'm only reporting the allegations. Personally, after meeting you, I strongly doubt their veracity. That's why I've come to warn you directly, rather than waiting for the official notification." Garrick rose, pacing back and forth in the room like a caged animal. His face, usually composed, now reflected a panic he no longer sought to hide. "What do you suggest, Counselor?" he finally asked. "An immediate and vigorous counterattack." Martin opened his briefcase, pulling out other documents. "I've prepared a preliminary response, contesting each allegation point by point. But we'll need solid proof of your mental capacity and the legitimacy of your marriage. And if we fail to convince the court—" Garrick's voice was barely audible. The lawyer hesitated, then responded with brutal honesty. "In the worst case, you could be placed under guardianship, losing control of your assets and even some personal decisions. Your marriage could be annulled if it's judged to have been contracted during a period of incapacity." A leaden silence fell over the room. Adelaide felt the world waver around her. Everything they had built together, this fragile but deep relationship, this nascent trust, this rediscovered happiness, all of it could be torn away by the jealousy of a woman who couldn't bear to see her brother escape her control. "No," Adelaide's voice was calm but determined. "We won't let this happen." She rose as well, a new resolution shining in her green eyes. "Counselor Blake, would you accept representing us in this case?" The lawyer appeared surprised, then nodded. "It would be an honor, Mrs. Harrington." "Good. Here's what we'll do." In the days that followed, Thornfield Estate transformed into a battle headquarters. Adelaide mobilized all her resources, Garrick's relationships in the business world, testimonies from estate employees, doctors who had treated Garrick over the years, and even the villagers she had helped since her arrival. But amid this feverish activity, Garrick seemed to sink into an abyss of despair. He spent long hours alone in the library or garden, barely responding when Adelaide spoke to him, eating little, sleeping even less. One evening she found him sitting in the darkness of their room, staring at an old photograph of himself as a child, alongside a smiling Octavia. "Garrick," she called softly, sitting beside him on the edge of the bed. He raised eyes reddened by fatigue and emotion toward her. "I don't understand," he murmured. "How did we get here? How can my sister hate me so much?" Adelaide gently took the photograph, observing the two children who seemed so happy, so innocent. "I don't think she hates you," she said after a moment of reflection. "I think she's afraid." Afraid of what? Of losing you. For years after Carolyn left, you belonged only to her. You were like an extension of herself, and now you're escaping her. You're becoming yourself again. Garrick remained silent, considering this perspective. Sometimes I wonder, he began, then stopped. What? Adelaide gently encouraged him. If all this is worth it. He rose, approaching the window that overlooked the garden bathed in moonlight. I could simply accept her terms. Divorce, give you a generous pension, return to my life before. It would be simpler. Adelaide felt her heart break a little at these words, but she understood the depth of his distress. Is that really what you want? He turned toward her, his face half in shadow. No. But I don't know if I have the strength to continue this battle. I'm tired, Adelaide. So tired. She rose and joined him by the window, taking his face between her hands as she had done that day in the garden, that day when everything had begun to change between them. Listen to me, Garrick Harrington. You're the strongest man I've ever met. You built an empire from almost nothing. You survived abandonment and betrayal. You found the courage to reopen your heart when it would have been so much easier to remain closed in your solitude. She pressed her forehead against his, their breaths mingling in the intimacy of this moment. And you're not alone in this battle. I'm here. I'll always be here. Why? He murmured, his voice barely audible. Why do you stay, when it would be so much simpler to leave? Adelaide smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Because I love you, you idiot. It was the first time she had spoken these words, the first time she had admitted this feeling that had grown within her over the months, transforming from gratitude into respect, then into deep affection, and finally into this love that had taken her by surprise. Garrick looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, his eyes lighting with a glow she had never seen in them before. You love me, he repeated, incredulous. With all my heart, she confirmed, letting flow the tears she had been holding back. And that's why we'll fight. Together. To the end. He drew her to him then, kissing her with a desperate passion that contained both their fear and their determination, their vulnerability and their strength. That night, in their intimate reunion, they silently promised never to give up, whatever obstacles Octavia or the world might place in their path. The depths of the abyss had been reached. All that remained was to climb, together toward the light. Autumn arrived in California in an explosion of colors. The vineyards dressed in red and gold, the hills rested in tones of gray-green, and the plane trees along the roads lost their leaves in a melancholic dance. In this transitional landscape, Adelaide and Garrick prepared their defense against Octavia's accusations, with a determination renewed since that night when they had confessed their feelings. This October morning, as the first mists enveloped the hills, an unknown car climbed the cypress-lined driveway leading to the estate. Adelaide, arranging chrysanthemums in the grand salon, glimpsed from the window an elderly man laboriously descending from the vehicle, leaning on a carved wooden cane. "Who is that?" she asked Eleanor, who was passing with a tea tray. The old housekeeper approached the window and let out a small cry of surprise. "It's Mr. George, Professor Veronese." "Who?" Adelaide had never heard this name. "The former tutor of Mr. Garrick and Miss Octavia," Eleanor quickly explained. "He used to come every summer when they were children. We haven't seen him for, at least 20 years. Garrick, alerted by the sound of the car, quickly descended the stairs. His face lit up with joyful surprise as he recognized the visitor. "Professor Veronese," he exclaimed, hurrying to help the old man climb the steps of the portico. "What an incredible surprise!" The man, whose wrinkled face brightened with a warm smile, embraced Garrick with emotion. "My little Garrick, though there's nothing little about you anymore, is there?" Adelaide observed this reunion from the threshold, touched by the evident affection between these two men. Professor Veronese had an intelligent face framed by disheveled white hair, blue eyes that twinkled with mischief behind tortoiseshell glasses, and an old-fashioned elegance in his tweed suit. "You must be Adelaide," he said, seeing her, bowing slightly with a courtesy from another time. "My dear child, I'm enchanted to make your acquaintance." "The pleasure is mine, Professor," Adelaide sincerely responded, charmed by the kindness emanating from this man. Once settled in the salon before steaming tea and fresh madeleines, Professor Veronese explained the reason for his unexpected visit. "I received a very disturbing letter from Octavia," he began, his expression darkening. "She asked me to testify regarding your mental balance during your youth, Garrick." Garrick and Adelaide exchanged a worried glance. "And what did you reply?" Garrick asked with apprehension. The old professor emitted a dry little laugh. "I told her I would take the first train to come see for myself how things stood, which I did." He took a sip of tea, carefully observing Garrick over his glasses. "You seem more alive than I've seen you in years, my boy. Your eyes have regained that spark I thought lost after—" He stopped, casting an embarrassed glance toward Adelaide. "After Carolyn left," Garrick gently completed. "Adelaide knows the whole story, Professor. We have no secrets from each other." These simple words, spoken so naturally, deeply touched Adelaide. It was true. Their relationship had been built on a sometimes painful, but always liberating honesty. "Well, well," the professor approved, smiling. "I never believed in mystery between spouses. Transparency is the fertile ground of trust, as I always told my students." He set down his cup and adopted a more serious expression. "Now let's talk about this ridiculous matter that Octavia has initiated against you. I did some research before coming." From his worn leather bag, he extracted several folders. "Octavia has always been possessive toward you, Garrick. I observed her when you were children, the way she overprotected you, how she systematically drove away anyone who tried to get close to you." He leafed through one of the folders, stopping on a particular page. "I kept detailed notes on all my students over the years. Here, dating from when you were 12, I was already expressing my concern about the relationship between Octavia and you, an unhealthy emotional dependence, where the elder sister seems to derive her identity from the control she exercises over her brother." Garrick appeared stunned. "I didn't know you had noticed all this. I was your tutor, my boy. Observing was my job." The professor smiled with benevolence. "I tried to speak to your parents about it, but your father was too absorbed in his business, and your mother, well, she had her own demons to fight." He turned toward Adelaide. "What I'm saying, my dear, is that this judicial procedure has nothing to do with Garrick's mental health. It's the continuation of a control pattern that has lasted since childhood, and I'm ready to testify to this before any court." Adelaide felt an immense weight lift from her chest. Here at last was someone who understood, who could explain the origin of this senseless situation. "Professor," she said with emotion, "you can't imagine how much your presence gives us hope again." "Oh, but I have better than my presence to offer," he responded with a mischievous wink. "I've brought letters, dozens of letters that Octavia wrote to me over the years, expressing without filters her feelings about her brother, her desire to protect him from the outside world, and particularly her visceral hatred toward Carolyn, whom she accused of having stolen Garrick." He pulled out a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. "I kept them, sensing that one day they might be important. That day has apparently arrived." Garrick took the letters with a trembling hand, scanning the lines of that fine, slanted handwriting he knew so well. His face expressed a mixture of shock and deep sadness. "I had never realized the extent of her obsession," he murmured. Professor Veronese placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You weren't meant to see it. Octavia has always been extremely adept at presenting one face to the world and another in private." He turned to Adelaide. "These letters, combined with my expert testimony in psychology, I taught this subject at Harvard for 30 years before my retirement, should be enough to convince any judge that this procedure is motivated by pathological personal reasons and not by a legitimate concern for Garrick's health." For the first time in weeks, Adelaide felt a true ray of hope. She squeezed the professor's hand with gratitude. "How could we ever thank you?" The old man smiled, his blue eyes twinkling behind his glasses. "By being happy, my children, that's all an old professor can wish for his former students, and perhaps by allowing me to enjoy your hospitality for a few days. I must admit this estate has always been one of my favorite places in America." "You can stay as long as you wish," Garrick responded with emotion. "Our home is yours." That night, as they prepared for bed, Adelaide noticed a subtle change in Garrick, a tension that had eased, a shadow that had dissipated. "You seem different," she observed gently, brushing her long hair before the vanity. He smiled, approaching to take the brush from her hands and continue this intimate gesture himself. I feel different. For the first time since the beginning of this affair, I have the impression we have a real chance of winning. We will win, she asserted with conviction, closing her eyes under the caress of the brush in her hair. Professor Veronese is an ideal witness. And those letters, it's not just that, he said, his voice taking on a deeper tone. It's the realization that, whatever happens with this procedure, I've already won something infinitely more precious. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze in the mirror. What? You? He responded simply. Your love, your strength, your faith in me, even when I had lost mine. He set down the brush and bent to gently kiss her nape, a shiver running down Adelaide's spine at this contact. When Octavia initiated this procedure, he continued, I was afraid you would leave, that you would decide I wasn't worth it, that you would realize you could have an easier life elsewhere, with someone less complicated. Adelaide rose and turned toward him, taking his face between her hands, as she loved to do, this gesture that had become their intimate ritual. Garrick Harrington, listen to me well, she said with a quiet intensity. I didn't come into this marriage by choice, but I choose to stay in it every day, not despite your complications, but partly because of them. It's the depth of your soul, with all its shadows and lights, that made me fall in love with you. She kissed him gently, then added with a mischievous smile, and besides, I'm not exactly an easy gift either, you know. He laughed, that rare and precious laugh that transformed his face, erasing the years of solitude and grief. No, indeed. Stubborn, passionate, determined to make everything abandoned bloom again, including broken hearts. He drew her to him, breathing in the grape scent of her hair. You're the miracle I never dared ask for, Adelaide Harrington. That night, in the comfort of their bed, entwined in the warmth of their shared love, they slept the peaceful sleep of those who, after the storm, finally glimpse a clearing sky. The day of the hearing arrived with the first frost of November, covering the dormant vineyards with a thin layer of rime that glittered under the morning sun. Adelaide stood before the window of their room, observing this transformed landscape, finding in this ephemeral beauty a presage of their own imminent metamorphosis. Garrick approached, adjusting his tie with slightly trembling fingers. He wore his most sober suit, anthracite grey white shirt, a touch of colour provided only by the silver tie-pin representing a grapevine, twin to the brooch Adelaide wore on her midnight blue suit. Ready? He asked softly. She turned toward him, admiring the quiet dignity that emanated from him despite the evident tension. Ready? Professor Veronese awaited them in the entrance hall, impeccable in his tweed suit, his leather bag containing the precious letters and his notes. Lawyer Blake had arrived the previous evening, bringing with him an impressive pile of favorable testimonies, business colleagues, estate employees, doctors attesting to Garrick's perfect mental health. The journey to the Boston Superior Court was made in a heavy silence laden with unexpressed thoughts. Adelaide squeezed Garrick's hand, transmitting through this simple contact all the strength and love she felt for him. From time to time he addressed her a smile, a tense but determined smile that said, "Together, whatever happens." The court was an imposing building with a neoclassical facade, its massive columns seeming to defy time and men. Inside, the cold marble echoed under their steps as they followed Lawyer Blake toward the courtroom. In the corridor they glimpsed Octavia, surrounded by an army of lawyers with austere faces. She wore an impeccable black suit that accentuated her angular silhouette, her grey hair pulled into a chignon so tight it seemed painful. When she saw Garrick, her brother whom she claimed to want to protect, her face remained perfectly impassive, as if frozen in a mask of icy determination. "Don't look at her," Adelaide murmured to Garrick, feeling his tension increase. "She's trying to destabilize you." He nodded imperceptibly, keeping his gaze fixed straight ahead as they entered the courtroom. The procedure began with a weighty formality. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a piercing gaze and rigorous bearing, listened to the preliminary arguments from both sides without betraying the slightest emotion. Octavia's lawyer, Mr. Dunham, presented the case with polished eloquence. He portrayed Garrick as a brilliant but fragile man, weakened by emotional trauma, who had plunged into an irrational marriage under the influence of an opportunistic young woman. He presented testimonies from former employees who described his reclusive behavior after Carolyn's departure. Psychiatric experts, who remotely analyzed signs of possible cognitive deterioration based on recent changes in his life. When it was Carolyn's turn to testify, Adelaide felt Garrick stiffen beside her. His ex-wife was still as elegant, her face barely marked by the years, her voice soft but assured as she described how Garrick had always been prone to periods of emotional instability, particularly under pressure. During our marriage, Carolyn explained with feigned compassion, these episodes were manageable. But after our separation, from what I could observe during professional encounters, his condition considerably deteriorated. "And how do you interpret his sudden new marriage?" asked Mr. Dunham. Carolyn cast a glance at Adelaide, a glance that contained a troubling mixture of pity and disdain. As a classic symptom of his need to cling to a stabilizing female figure, even at the cost of choosing someone who doesn't share his life experience or social status, Adelaide had to call upon all her control to not visibly react to this barely veiled insult. She squeezed Garrick's hand tighter, feeling his contained rage. When it was their turn to present their defense, Lawyer Blake deployed a measured and effective strategy. He began by calling to the stand financial experts who detailed Garrick's recent business successes, demonstrating impeccable mental acuity and business judgment. Then it was Professor Veronese's turn. The old man approached the stand with quiet dignity, leaning slightly on his cane. His testimony was devastating in its simplicity. "I've known Garrick Harrington since he was 5 years old," he began. "I was his tutor for 12 consecutive summers. I observed his development, his interactions with his family, particularly with his sister Octavia." He adjusted his glasses, his gaze briefly falling on Octavia, whose face had imperceptibly paled. "What I see today is not a man in mental decline, but on the contrary, a man who for the first time in years seems to have regained his emotional balance." He then produced the letters, presenting them to the court. "These documents are letters that Miss Harrington wrote to me over the years. They reveal a troubling pattern of possessive attachment toward her brother, a constant desire to control his relationships, and a manifest hostility toward any person likely to create an emotional bond with him." As the judge perused the letters, the professor continued, "As a psychologist who taught at Harvard for 30 years, I can affirm that this procedure is not motivated by legitimate concern for Garrick Harrington's mental health, but by Octavia Harrington's pathological fear of losing her influence over him." A murmur traversed the room. Octavia, usually so composed, now seemed agitated, furiously whispering in her lawyer's ear. When it was Adelaide's turn to testify, she approached the stand with a quiet assurance that impressed even her detractors. Dressed simply but elegantly, she embodied a natural dignity that contrasted with the accusations of opportunism brought against her. "Mrs. Harrington," the judge began, "could you explain to us how you met your husband and the circumstances of your marriage?" Adelaide took a deep breath and launched into a disarmingly honest account. She spoke of the initial arrangement, of those first months of solitude at the estate, of the slow transformation of their marriage of convenience into a true union. She didn't seek to embellish or romanticize. She simply presented the truth, with its imperfections and its moments of grace. And when she was called to testify, she spoke with a passion that surprised everyone present in the courtroom. "This man gave me a home when my family needed one. I gave him a reason to start living again. This isn't madness, it's love." A silence followed this simple but powerful declaration. The judge observed her attentively, as if seeking to read beyond the words, to perceive the truth in her eyes. "And if this court were to declare your husband incompetent," the judge finally asked, "what would you do, Mrs. Harrington?" The question was a trap, designed to reveal potential financial motivations. Adelaide smiled gently, meeting the judge's gaze without hesitation. "I would stay by his side, Your Honor, with or without his name, with or without his fortune. I love him for the man he is, not for what he possesses." From across the room, Garrick was looking at her with an expression worth all the testimonies in the world, a mixture of love, pride, and gratitude that couldn't be feigned. After hours of testimonies and pleadings, the judge announced a recess to deliberate. Adelaide, Garrick, Professor Veronese, and Lawyer Blake withdrew to a small adjoining room, waiting in palpable tension. "What are the chances?" Garrick asked Lawyer Blake. The lawyer nodded with cautious optimism. The professor's testimony hit home, And yours, Mrs. Harrington, was remarkable. But it's difficult to predict how the judge will interpret all the elements. An hour later, they were recalled to the courtroom. The judge, her face still as impassive, spoke. After careful examination of the testimonies and evidence presented, this court rejects the request for guardianship of Mr. Garrick Harrington. She paused, looking directly at Octavia. The elements suggesting an inappropriate personal motivation behind this request are particularly troubling. She turned toward Garrick and Adelaide. Mr. and Mrs. Harrington, you are free to continue your life as you see fit. This court has found no evidence of mental incapacity or manipulation. On the contrary, it has observed what appears to be a sincere and mutually beneficial relationship. The case was dismissed. Octavia was exposed and ostracized. But the cost was high. Garrick had to cut ties with the only blood family he had left, a decision that haunted him on nights when Adelaide found him looking at old photographs of them as children, playing in the wheat fields of their childhood home in Massachusetts. Leaving the courthouse under a November sky that had miraculously cleared, Adelaide and Garrick walked hand in hand, followed by Professor Veronese, who smiled with the satisfaction of a man who has done a good deed. They passed Octavia, who stood motionless on the steps, abandoned by her lawyers, her face marked not by defeat, but by a solitude that suddenly aroused Adelaide's compassion. "Wait," she said gently to Garrick. Then, despite his protests, she approached Octavia. "I'm sorry it ended this way," she said simply. "He still loves you, you know. You're his sister. If one day you're ready to see us as allies rather than enemies, our door will be open." Octavia looked at her with surprise, then her face hardened again. "I don't need your pity." "It's not pity," Adelaide responded gently. "It's hope. Hope that wounds heal, that hearts change, as his has, as mine has." She rejoined Garrick without waiting for a response, knowing that certain seeds simply needed to be planted and left to time to germinate. On the way back to California, toward their estate that was no longer a mausoleum but a home, Garrick seemed both exhausted and invigorated, as if an immense weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" Adelaide asked softly, observing his profile against the landscape scrolling past the plane window. He turned to her with a gaze of infinite tenderness. "I'm thinking that sometimes storms come not to destroy us, but to clear the path towards something new. Something better." He took her hand, intertwining their fingers as they had done so many times in these past months, a simple gesture that had become the symbol of their union, of their shared strength. "I'm also thinking," he added with a smile that erased the last traces of worry from his face, "that it's time to truly begin our life, together, without shadows from the past." Adelaide smiled in response, feeling in these words the promise of a future they would build day by day, season after season, like a garden patiently cultivated. The following spring, when the vineyards were in bloom, filling the air with their delicate fragrance, something miraculous happened. Adelaide discovered she was pregnant. This April morning, as the California sun illuminated their bedroom with a golden light, she contemplated the positive test in her trembling hands. A new life, a miracle she hadn't dared hope for so soon. Garrick had left at dawn to supervise the pruning of the vines, still unaware of the news that would transform their existence. Adelaide dressed with care, choosing a simple white cotton dress that floated around her like a cloud, and headed toward the fields where she knew she would find him. He stood among the vine rows, discussing with the cellar-master, his face animated by this rekindled passion for his domain. When he saw her approaching along the cypress-lined path, his expression lit up as it always did now when he saw her, a mixture of joy and wonder, as if he still couldn't believe his happiness. "Adelaide!" he called, excusing himself to the cellar-master to meet her. "What a surprise to see you here so early." She smiled, suddenly nervous despite the certainty of his joy. "I needed to talk to you. Can we walk a bit?" He nodded, intrigued by her mysterious air, and they moved away along the vine rows, their steps raising small clouds of ochre dust in the morning light. "Do you remember that secret garden I restored when I arrived?" she began, carefully choosing her words. "How could I forget?" he responded with a tender smile. "It's where everything began to change between us. You told me one day that certain things thought dead could bloom again if given a second chance." He stopped, looking at her with curiosity. "Yes, I remember." Adelaide took a deep breath, then took his hand and gently placed it on her still flat belly. Well, it seems that life always finds a way to bloom again, even where it was no longer expected. He looked at her without understanding for a moment, then realization dawned on his face. Incomprehension, doubt, hope, and finally a joy so pure it seemed to transfigure his features. "You mean?" he murmured, his voice breaking with emotion. She nodded, tears in her eyes. "We're going to have a child, Garrick." He remained motionless for a moment, as if paralyzed by the news. Then, in a gesture that surprised her with its spontaneity, he lifted her in his arms and turned with her amid the vineyards, laughing and crying at the same time, attracting amused glances from workers in the distance. "A child," he repeated, as if he couldn't believe it. "Our child." When he finally set her down, his eyes shone with an emotion she had never seen in them before, joy mixed with a new vulnerability. "I'm afraid," he admitted softly, placing his hand again on her belly with infinite tenderness. "For years with Carolyn, we tried. The repeated disappointments, hopes crushed month after month. That's what began to destroy us." Adelaide covered his hand with hers. "I know, and I can't promise you that everything will be perfect, but I can promise you that whatever happens, we'll face it together." He nodded, his eyes not leaving hers. Together. It's the most beautiful word in the world when you're the one saying it. The news left them paralyzed, him fearing to repeat past frustrations, her fearing not to live up to expectations. But together, hand in hand, they faced every medical consultation in San Francisco, every moment of anxiety. The months passed, transforming their lives like the seasons transform the California landscape. Adelaide's belly rounded, becoming the center of a new world being built around them. Garrick, who had never been a demonstrative man, surprised everyone with his constant tenderness, preparing a nursery in the most beautiful room of the estate, the one that received the morning light through century-old windows, reading poems to Adelaide's belly each evening, learning to cook dishes his wife craved at improbable hours of the night. A new peace had settled between them, as if this promise of future life had finally exorcised the last ghosts of the past. Even the childhood photographs with Octavia didn't disappear. They simply found their place in an album that Garrick sometimes leafed through with a placated melancholy, telling stories of his father and his aunt to the unborn child, perhaps hoping that one day reconciliation would become possible. Autumn arrived, then winter, and with it the first pains. On a January night when the wind howled around the estate like a chorus of ancient spirits, Adelaide felt the contractions begin. Garrick, who had barely slept for weeks, anticipating this moment, instantly awoke. "Is it time?" he asked, suddenly perfectly alert. She nodded, gritting her teeth against a new wave of pain. "I think so." What followed was a whirlwind of controlled activity. The call to the doctor who had agreed to come to the estate for the delivery, Eleanor preparing hot water and clean cloths, Meredith reciting prayers in a half voice in the hallway. The hours that followed were both interminable and fleeting, time seeming to stretch under the effect of pain and anticipation. Garrick remained at Adelaide's side throughout, wiping her brow, holding her hand, murmuring encouragements, when the contractions became almost unbearable. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known," he repeated like a mantra. "You can do it. We're almost there." And finally, as dawn began to break, tinting the sky with a delicate pink that filtered through the bedroom curtains, a powerful cry resounded, the first breath, the first voice of a new being entering their world. "A girl," announced the doctor with a tired but radiant smile. "A magnificent little girl." When she finally gave birth to a healthy baby girl whose cries resonated through the estate like celestial music, Garrick openly wept for the first time since she had known him. They named her Faye because that's exactly what she represented. "You've taught me something I thought I had lost forever," he said, holding his daughter in his arms with a tenderness that contrasted with his large, calloused hands. "You've taught me that the heart can heal. That love isn't something we lose when someone abandons us, but something that multiplies when we allow others in." Faye had her mother's eyes, a deep green like vines before flowering, and her father's determined features. She was perfect, a living miracle that represented all their love had created and transformed. In the days that followed, a letter arrived, bearing the seal of the panther, Octavia. Garrick opened it with apprehension, then read it aloud to Adelaide, who was nursing Faye by the window. "My dear brother," the letter began in that familiar, fine, slanted handwriting, "I have learned of the birth of your daughter. I cannot say my feelings are simple in this regard, but I can say this. Family, despite everything, remains family. If one day you wish me to meet my niece, I will be there. With respect, Octavia." It wasn't an apology, it wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning, a small sprout of hope that, like their once-abandoned garden, might one day bloom again. The estate, once a mausoleum of silence, transformed into a vibrant home. The child's laughter mingled with the scent of jasmine, the sound of music, and the murmur of evenings where workers and owners sat side by side, sharing California wine and local cheeses. Adelaide hadn't just saved her family's estate in Sonoma. She had saved the soul of a man who thought he was beyond redemption. With Garrick's financial help and expertise, Adelaide's family estate had also come back to life. A new variety of grape, more resistant to disease, had been planted on the advice of agricultural scientists. The fields that had nearly disappeared were flourishing again, and Emmett, Adelaide's father, was slowly regaining the pride of seeing his legacy secured for future generations. One summer evening, when Faye had just celebrated her first birthday, Adelaide and Garrick sat on the terrace overlooking the vineyards bathed in the golden light of sunset. The little girl slept peacefully in her father's arms, her breathing as light as the beating of butterfly wings. "Look at her," murmured Meredith as she passed with a tray of freshly picked fruit. "She's the spitting image of her mother." "But she has her father's character," Adelaide laughed softly, observing how, even in sleep, Faye kept her little fists clenched, determined and strong. Garrick smiled, caressing his daughter's auburn curls. "I hope she'll have your generosity and courage instead." A comfortable silence settled between them, filled only by the singing of cicadas and the whisper of wind through the cypresses. It was in these moments of perfect quietude that Adelaide measured the path travelled since that October day, when she had descended the stairs as a resigned bride. "What are you thinking about?" asked Garrick, observing her thoughtful expression. "I'm thinking about the fear I had that day when I married you," she responded with honesty, "and how distant that fear seems now." He extended his free hand toward her, that hand that once knew only how to sign contracts and manipulate figures, and that now also knew how to cradle a child and caress a cheek with tenderness. "Do you know what I regret the most?" he asked, his amber gaze reflecting the last rays of the sun. "What?" "All those months when I shut myself in my study, in my pain, while you were there, bringing life to this dead house, all that lost time." Adelaide squeezed his hand, gently shaking her head. "Nothing is lost. Everything contributed to bringing us here, to this precise moment. The detours are part of the journey." He smiled, recognizing in these words the simple wisdom that had first intrigued him, then fascinated him, and finally conquered him. "I love you, Adelaide Harrington," he said simply. "You and our daughter are the miracle I no longer expected." She leaned in to kiss him gently, taking care not to wake Faye. "And we love you, Garrick Harrington, more than words can say." Above them, the first stars began to appear in the California sky, silent witnesses to a happiness that had arisen from the ashes of resignation and despair. The vines, swaying in the breeze, seemed to whisper secrets as old as time, that life always finds its way, that true love is never lost, and that sometimes the deepest wounds become the soil for the most beautiful blossoms. 5 years later, the September light filtered through the leaves of the plane trees, casting dancing shadows on the long table set in the once-abandoned garden, now transformed into a paradise of colors and fragrances. Lanterns suspended from the branches awaited twilight to illuminate what would be an evening of celebration. Adelaide, now in her 28th year, arranged bouquets of white grapes and pale roses in handcrafted ceramic vases. Her movements were still as graceful, but now carried the quiet assurance of a woman who had found her place in the world. "Mom, look what I found!" Faye, who would soon be 6 years old, ran toward her, her auburn curls flying behind her like a living flame. In her hands, she preciously held a butterfly with iridescent blue wings. "It's a blue morpho," explained Adelaide, crouching to admire her daughter's discovery. "Very rare. You're lucky to have spotted it. Can I show it to Dad and read?" "Of course, but remember what we said about living creatures. Observe without capturing, admire without damaging, the little girl solemnly recited, before running back toward the house. Adelaide smiled as she watched her daughter disappear inside the estate. Faye had inherited her curiosity for nature and Garrick's determination, a combination that promised a remarkable personality. She was finishing arranging the flowers when familiar footsteps echoed on the stone slabs. Garrick appeared carrying their 2-year-old son, Reed, on his shoulders. The little boy laughed heartily, his amber eyes, identical to his father's, shining with excitement. "Here are the men of my life," said Adelaide with a tender smile. Garrick set Reed on the ground, who immediately rushed to his mother for a hug. At 50, Garrick had maintained his imposing stature, but his face had softened over the years, lines of worry replaced by laugh lines. His hair, now almost completely grey, gave him a distinguished air that only accentuated his charm. "Is everything ready for tonight?" he asked, embracing Adelaide around the waist after she had kissed Reed. "Almost. The musicians will arrive in an hour, dinner is being prepared, and the guests are expected at sunset." Tonight, they were celebrating the 5th anniversary of their foundation, the Vine of Hope, an organization they had created to support farming families affected by environmental and economic crises. What had begun as a modest initiative had become a network of solidarity that now extended throughout California. "I received a message from your father," said Garrick, following Reed with his gaze, as the boy now explored a rosemary bush buzzing with bees. "He'll arrive with the last batch of organic wine for the donor gifts." Adelaide nodded, grateful that her father had found not only financial stability thanks to their help, but also a new meaning to his life by becoming the master vintner of their foundation, teaching his art to younger generations. "And," Garrick hesitated for a moment, "I also received a response from Octavia." Adelaide's heart skipped a beat. After Faye's birth, relations with Octavia had slowly, very slowly, improved. Brief visits, tense at first, then progressively more relaxed, had paved the way for a fragile but real reconciliation. Yet Octavia had still never accepted to participate in a public event with them. "She's coming?" asked Adelaide, hardly daring to believe it. Garrick smiled, his eyes shining with contained emotion. "Yes, she said it was time she saw for herself what her little brother and his impossible wife have accomplished." Adelaide laughed, recognizing in these words the characteristic mixture of affection and sarcasm that defined Octavia. "That's wonderful. The children will be happy to see their aunt." "I'm not sure happy is the term Octavia would use to describe her interactions with our little tornadoes," Garrick joked, alluding to how Faye and Reed always challenged the meticulous order Octavia tried to impose around herself. "She loves them in her way," Adelaide responded, "just as she loves you in her way." Garrick nodded, his gaze momentarily lost in memories. "There are wounds that never completely heal," he said softly. "But they can become less painful with time." Adelaide took his hand, understanding perfectly what he meant. Their path had not been without obstacles: her father's illness the previous year, the occasional difficulties with Garrick's business, the nights of worry when Reed had developed pneumonia during his first winter. But together they had faced every trial, their bond strengthening with each storm weathered. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when the first guests arrived. Local farmers, artisans, families helped by their foundation, friends who had become dear over the years. The garden came alive with conversations and laughter. The musicians installed under the pergola began to play, and the delicious aroma of dinner spread in the evening air. Adelaide observed this scene with a silent gratitude. The estate that had been so cold upon her arrival was now an open, living home, resonating with love and generosity. When Octavia appeared at the garden entrance, hesitant despite her still haughty bearing, it was Faye who spotted her first. Without the slightest hesitation, the little girl ran to her aunt and dragged her by the hand to show her the butterfly she had found earlier, now carefully drawn in her observation notebook. Adelaide and Garrick exchanged a moved glance, seeing Octavia bend, with a stiffness that wasn't only physical, to examine her niece's drawing. Something in this picture, this woman who had spent her life controlling and isolating herself, now initiated into the simple wonders of nature by a child without prejudice, seemed to embody all that their journey represented: healing, transformation, acceptance. Later in the evening, After the speeches and dinner, while the music continued to play and the children ran between the lit lanterns like giant fireflies, Garrick led Adelaide aside, toward the small stone bench in the shade of the great oak tree. "I have something for you," he said, pulling from his pocket a small package wrapped in tissue paper. Adelaide opened it with curiosity, discovering a delicate silver bracelet from which hung a single charm in the shape of a grapevine, encrusted with emeralds. "It's magnificent," she murmured, touched by this unexpected gesture. "Turn it over," he suggested gently. She obeyed and discovered, engraved inside the charm, two simple words that summarized their story: "Allow bloom." Tears rose to her eyes as she remembered that stormy night years ago when she had told him, "You don't need to be ready. You just need to allow it." "You remember," she said, moved. "I remember every moment," he responded, fastening the bracelet to her wrist. "Every word, every gesture that brought me back to life." He took her face between his hands, that gesture that had become their intimate ritual, and looked at her with an intensity that hadn't diminished despite the years. "When I see you with our children, with your father, with the people we help, even with my impossible sister," he said with a tender smile, "I wonder how I could have been so fortunate. How did the universe decide that I deserved this second chance?" Adelaide placed her hands on his, her heart overflowing with a love that seemed to grow each day. "Perhaps it's not a question of deserving," she responded softly. "Perhaps it's simply the nature of love. It doesn't ask for perfection, just openness. Like flowers that ask only for a bit of earth, water, and light to transform the world with their beauty." He kissed her then, a kiss that contained all the promises kept and those still to come. Around them, the garden seemed to breathe with life. The roses, the jasmine, the white grapes that had been the first symbol of their rebirth. From the terrace came the laughter of guests, the music of guitars and violins, the joyful voices of their children. The life they had created together, against all expectations, flourished like the vineyards under the California sun, resilient, fragrant, eternally renewed. And when she saw him playing with Fay and Reed in the garden they had planted together, while the setting sun painted the white walls of the California estate gold, she understood that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not facing the unknown, but allowing the unknown to transform you. True love, she discovered, is not only given or received, it is cultivated like the century-old vineyards that now flourished in every corner of this land that had become her home. Like the vine that survives the harshest winters to explode in colors every spring, their love had traversed adversity to become stronger, deeper, truer. It was a love that feared neither seasons nor time, a love that, like the gardens they cultivated together, would continue to bloom and transform, year after year, season after season, enriching not only their lives, but also those of all they touched. In the night sky above the estate, the stars appeared one by one, silent witnesses to this simple but profound truth, that even in the most unlikely places, even after the longest winters, life always finds its way to bloom again.